All right, rewatchers, welcome to the time portal. We've hit the rewind button and we are ready for another episode of Retro Rewatch.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to episode 4. We have rounded the that stat that I said last week about over 9% of podcasts don't make it episode 4. Well, we're in top 10%. And we're at episode 4, and we're going to talk about non-conventional vampire movies. Great topic that Chris and Brad, special guest Brad, who is a childhood friend of mine, went to high school together, and we reconnected recently over a passing of the man, the myth, the legend, Ryan Brewer. Rest in peace. Hope he's overlooking and seeing everything. How we doing today, Brad?
Doing great. How y'all?
Thanks for
Doing
joining
good,
us.
Brad.
And we're going to jump right into it. Top vampire non-conventional movies. Actually, did a rewatch of this yesterday. Found it on Paramount Plus because I'm a cheap ass. And I know you guys probably found some copies, but anyway, I'm going to start out with From Dusk Till Dawn, 1996 movie. George Clooney, there it is, the live copy there. George Clooney, Quentin Tarantino. I always like to start off with a little background box office. So, $19 million budget, and it made 25, a little over 25 million, which I think that's pretty decent at the time. I know it's back in 1996. But why I picked this, and I know we were debating with Chris and Brad. If you've never seen this movie, look at the cover, know nothing about
Major
it.
spoilers ahead.
Yeah, here's your spoilers if you want to check it out. It's like 61 minutes, 62 minutes, whatever it is. It's like a heist criminal movie. And then all of a sudden it just gets crazy in the titty twister. And it gets crazy with vampires and just gets with nudity, and I'll say in a nice way, all types of poutine. It's mentioned whatever boobs, 90s. It's great. It just gets crazy. And that's why I picked that non-conventional, because if you've never even seen it, like, hey, what's this From Dusk Till Dawn, man? And it gets a little nutty the last 40-some minutes. So that's why I picked
so on TV, do you know what they actually called it instead of the titty twister?
What was that?
It was the kitty twister. I don't know that that's any better. But you're talking about like you had Cheech Marin out on the front steps, like talking about all the different we'll call it the kitties
flavors.
All the different flavors.
There it is. Nice way of putting it. Hey, speaking of that, Cheech Marin, did he have 3 different characters in there? Because I noticed he popped up 3 different times. Was he 3 different characters in that movie?
Yeah, he did, because he was one of the main boss of the cartel. He was the doorman, and then he was one of the police officers that stopped them. And actually, it's funny because you talk about when he was the police officer that stopped him at the border. He was actually wearing a name tag that was his dad's name tag, because his dad was actually a police officer. So I think it was Oscar Marin or something. I think that's correct.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, and some of the interesting thing, I thought that George Clooney and Quentin Tarantino had a great big brother, little brother relationship. You couldn't really tell at first what they really were, but that later kind of got into it. And Quentin Tarantino, he's always been known as a great director, but I thought he did a pretty good job of being an actor. Got the foot fetish that we wanted to bring up. I think he actually had a foot fetish in real life, but this is definitely dives into that with Selma Hayek and some other things. So that was interesting. Young Danny Trejo, talking about the cast, Harvey Keitel, Selma Hayek, of course, which we'll get into. Just a real interesting. Danny Trejo, before he got really old and just a lot of tats, and he started doing like every movie under the sun. Doesn't he have well over 100 movies to his credit?
So, it's funny. We talked about Seagal.
There it is, man.
There's having what I was going to say is we were talking about Seagal having, I thought he had like 100 movies or something like that, but Danny Trejo actually has like 300 or something along those lines.
There it is, man.
Not even kidding. So here's the poster for From Dusk Till Dawn. So, I mean, you do have like the bar in the background, the bats there. This guy, real quick, I want to talk about Michael Parks real quick, and then we'll get back to the actual vampires. But, talking about Quentin Tarantino and all the movies he's made, he's actually acted in a lot of them. But this guy, he actually shows us that Kill Bill, Grindhouse, which was Planet Terror, and Death Proof, and this movie are all for sure in the main universe, because this is Michael Parks and he plays the same character, which I believe is Sheriff McGriff, maybe. But he plays the same character in all of those films. So we know that they take place in the same universe. There's George Clooney
Earl
said,
McGraw, Texas Ranger Earl McGraw, according to IMDb.
We're gonna come back to a couple of those pictures, but there's Danny Trejo whenever he's a little bit younger. Before Brad, you hadn't really said much yet, but one of the things we talked about with to start this thing was the non-traditional vampire. So here's one of the first things when it starts to learn, you're starting to figure out that it's got something supernatural to it. This is the first sign. So I don't know of any other vampire movies off the top of my head where the vampires have green blood. I mean, I'm sure it's out there, but I can't think of it. But I thought that was really cool that the vampires had green blood.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And then when you also talk about the vampires that are a little bit different in this movie, typically one of the things you see with vampires is that they're a little more durable. That's one of the powers that they have. And in this one, they actually talk about how their skin is soft and squishy because they were literally ramming like 2x2 square legs off of tables like into their chest. And they even comment on how you couldn't do that to a human, but you can do that to these vampires. So that's very much non-traditional from what you normally see in a vampire.
Yeah. Also, Fred Williamson to me was a badass. I was really loving him at the very end. He was kicking some butt. I think he took out about 4 or 5 vampires with some of the stakes and everything. Yeah. I will say this. So that's the positives and everything. I'll say a little negatives on this. Like,
that was one of the coolest shots to me in this whole movie, right there.
Yeah, me too.
He's got it. Like that pyramid scene, like that was always one of the coolest things about this whole movie.
Yeah, I thought so as well, because that kind of showed how long these things have been doing. Like, I mean, if you look in there, you see wagon wheels. I mean, it's an Aztec temple, clearly, which is where the vampires came from, which there again, I'm sure there's Aztec vampire like mythos out there, but I'm unaware of it. So, I mean, these vampires all look pretty different than what I'm used to seeing as vampires anyway. I mean, a lot of vampires do transform and stuff, but like for instance, in this movie, they do become bats. And then there's this weird rat monster dog thing that Tom Savini like turns into when he gets his head ripped off. But Trey, we didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead and get back to your topic.
Yeah, I was about to say that was most of the positive, great casting. Some of the things I would say on the negatives, because it's not a perfect film, was kind of got that like Lost Boys vampire look to me. Some of when they transformed and everything, and it kind of had that kind of campy. Maybe it was just the version I was watching. CGI special effects really didn't age that well compared. I know it's a 1996 movie and it is a low budget movie, 19 million. So that would just be maybe some of the negatives. But they're overall like pacing of the movie, some of the kills, definitely some of the interesting vampires and everything. So that was kind of the negatives, maybe the special effects, and it was got a little cheesy at the end. But it was crazy though, the way everything went down.
Well, Robert Rodriguez, here we've talked about him again, because last week we were talking about Sin City, and he's the one that directed this movie, but I feel like he did a lot with what he had, because there's several shots in there where that shows a lot of different vampires, and they only had the budget to have like 6 full body suits at a time. So they actually had like paper cardboard stand-ups. They had puppets, that they used for different shots, and they were able to kind of put all these things into frame at the same time to make it look like they had more than they actually had, if you understand what I'm saying. Yeah. But one thing about this movie too is a lot of traditional older vampire movies, especially, are horror films. It's like, oh, Dracula's coming to get you, and he's hiding in the shadows, and you can't see his reflection in a mirror, and you've got all these things. That wasn't really From Dusk Till Dawn. From Dusk Till Dawn was pretty out there. I mean, it was nonstop. I think the body count's like 200 or 150 or something like that. I mean, they kill a lot of vampires. There's no real horror to this other than the fact that they're ugly. You know what I'm saying? So it kind of starts to lend more into like an action type vampire movie, rather than the traditional horror type vampire movie, which I think will kind of lead us into the next film that we want to talk about. Brad, have you got your Blu-ray with you?
I do, in fact. Sundown, The Vampire in Retreat. I think this is one that most folks probably have never seen or even heard of. It's definitely a non-traditional vampire movie in the fact that you have actual spoilers ahead. Dracula is one of the main characters in the movie, but very different than we've ever seen Dracula before. So in this movie, we have a reformed Dracula who is attempting to coexist with humans, not only coexist, but cohabitate with humans. And so they are doing things, for me, I know it's the first time I'd ever seen it in a movie where you have they're creating like fake blood to be able to sustain life without having to kill humans. And then they also create wooden bullets specifically to kill vampires. So they've got all these unique things that I think are copied many times later in other movies, even down to just, the funniness, because I didn't mention, but this movie is a comedy. So talking about non-traditional vampire movies, leading off of what you were saying with, going back to original Dracula type stuff, and From Dusk Till Dawn being a little different there, being more of an action type. It is one of those that it seems like it's more of a comedy. It is absolutely just funny throughout the whole movie. It's got Bruce Campbell as the male lead in it, one of the leads in it. And so, I mean, if you know Bruce Campbell, he's always kind of slapstick humor anyway. David Carradine, I mean, that's it's kind of funny. I think he was a little intoxicated for a lot of the shots because the way he delivers his lines is very comedic, but it actually fits really well with his character. But again, one of the things they had was, creating the fake blood. They had like these forked straws so that they could kind of be drinking like out of both teeth at the same time from their fake blood. But very unique movie. Like I said, a lot of good, funny stuff within it. It is there is a little bit of action at the end. I mean, clearly it's like a war scene, I guess we'll say, but not like any other type of real action stuff. A lot of good 90s shoot 'em up stuff. I think this movie came out around 90. Y'all had the stats on like what its budget and all was. I don't even know that I've ever looked at that. Those three brothers are hilarious there.
Yeah, I was going to say, before we get to the stats, let's talk about a few of these pictures I've got real quick. So these ZZ Top characters we got here, they were pretty funny because, I mean, you notice they're sitting in this swing, like, underneath this hot tin roof, and they got their SPF 100 on, so they can, in their working gloves there, even though they're just sitting with their three blind mice look here, But to what you were saying, Brad, like this is, even though it's a low budget movie, it's pretty innovative. Like, but this is their plant where they were creating the fake blood, which looked kind of like baby formula or something. Now, it kind of surprised me that they made it look kind of like, spoiled milk or something rather than like making it red. So at least it would visually like lie to you that, hey, no, it's really blood. Because that was one thing they really complained about the taste and the texture of it. It was like, okay, well, it may sustain us and we won't die, but we can't enjoy it. And then I figured this was probably what David Carradine looked after his bender. He was drinking in the coffin and they said, hey, it's time to like get on. And he's like, what now? What do you say? Line.
So going back to that milk, whenever they would they threw bottles a few times and you would see it. And I mean, it was lumpy and all. I mean, it literally looked like, rotted cultured type milk or something, it very much was something very unappealing. I would not want to drink it.
Yeah. And I mean, this is Bruce Campbell, for anybody that knows him from Evil Dead fame. We talked about him in the first episode of the channel. You can't see it here, the reason I got the picture, but he's actually got a piece of glass that's stuck in his shoulder. And it happens somewhere around 50 minutes into the movie. It stays there for the rest of the movie. So I don't know if it was an accident that like, hey, Bruce, you've got a piece of glass in you. And they were like, well, it's there. We got to leave it there now. But it was actually pretty funny. And knowing the slapstick stuff that he did with all the Evil Dead films and Army of Darkness, I mean, it just fit right in with the persona of Bruce Campbell. And of course, the character he's played is like a descendant of Van Helsing, who is completely incompetent, but I mean, it's still pretty slapstick and funny. And this is that bullet, like you were talking about, that's made of wood, which again, I don't. They kind of wood. It would have to be fortified wood because otherwise the explosion would just kind of disintegrate it and it wouldn't go anywhere. I'm still fairly certain it would, but at least it's a pretty neat concept that up to now I don't think I'd ever really seen or noticed. And again, we've got I think in almost all these movies, I'm going to have a bat, because that was kind of one of the things that seems to be very common with the vampire mythos, whether it's a new one or traditional or whatever. And just a couple scenes of some of the shootout, like you were talking about, the battle that's at the end of the movie, which was actually a pretty long battle. I mean, it wasn't like super choreographed per se, but I mean, there was a pretty fair amount of action for what it is.
And it spans across like the entire town, which going back, there's a lot of like religious stuff within the movie, obviously the crosses, but like the town itself is purgatory. You've got this whole story about vampires, which in many of the mythos on vampires, they are a fallen being type thing, very much on the sinful side. And you've got this group that are trying to redeem themselves. And so, you've got all that going on within the movie as well. But like I say, that fight scene, it spans across the entire town and the houses. I mean, so it's like a couple of miles it goes across. And so it's kind of neat how they weave all that in through there on that scene.
I'm
talking about this movie being made. I think this may have been Vistron's last movie as well. And so that movie is shot in the Moab desert, and there are these beautiful, like wide shots of the desert and all. It's actually a really pretty movie. A lot of it is quite neat.
Yeah. Now I kind of wanted to, in relation to Sundown, I kind of wanted to talk about this movie, Underworld. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but the reason that I bring this up and why it's important is we were talking about the wooden bullets and the action that kind of was in From Dusk Till Dawn. And now you've got Sundown, which Sundown came before From Dusk Till Dawn, but the Underworld came out sometime around 2000 to 2003, somewhere in that general area. Very action oriented. You had werewolves, you had vampires, and it's based around a war between the vampires and the werewolves, and the vampires are trying to eradicate the werewolves. And what is truly interesting about this is, more thought has gone into the bullets and the armature, or the weapons that these two factions are using against each other. And it's very, very parallel with how it works to Sundown. You've got, for the vampires, they're using these silver nitrate bullets where whenever they shoot and it hits a target, it starts to ooze. So this is important because the werewolves have kind of evolved that when they're getting shot with silver bullets, they can actually almost like flex their muscles and get the bullet back out. So, I mean, before it can kill them, they've gotten the allergen out of their system. But with this, there's nothing to expel. It just goes into their bloodstream to their heart and they disintegrate and die. And then inversely, from the werewolves to the vampires, they have these fluorescent, I guess is what they call, something along those lines, bullets, where whenever they were shooting at the vampires, and if it hit a vampire, it was like the sun exploded inside of them. So, I mean, all that stuff was very, very cool. And kind of along the same lines, a movie that we're going to talk about after this that Trey is going to discuss is going to use some of what we've got here. Again, going back to Sundown, though, we've got this blood that these vampires are able to use. There's no human here. They've got these different blood banks and things that they're able to synthesize and be able to survive off of and stay kind of out of the limelight, if you will, while they're waging their war.
One other thing that's going to be similar between the vampires in Sundown and the vampires in Underworld, now that you mentioned it, talking about traditional vampires, if you will, some type of control link between like the sire and their offspring. And then a lot of times there's even, vampires are typically thought about as being evil. So once someone's turned into vampire, they usually lose some level of their self-control or, affinity toward humans, and they have more of an evil mindset. But if you'll notice in both Underworld and in Sundown, like when they're converted into vampires, they're basically just vampire versions of whoever they were before.
They're basically
they were evil before, they're
right.
evil now. But if they weren't, they're basically
they're not like the three brides of Dracula that are doing his bidding and stuff like that. And one other thing about Underworld too that makes it unique to any other film, especially up to its point that I'm aware of, we have the Abomination, which is the combination of werewolf blood and vampire blood to create Scott Speedman's character, which is kind of a werewolf vampire hybrid, which again, talking about unconventional vampire movies, that was very unique, and then now you kind of have a third faction of the war of like, well, we've got this single superhuman, literally superhuman abomination that we are fighting, and we're vampires and we're werewolves. So this is going to kind of lead us into your next movie, Trey. You got it's going to be Blade. Blade is a really super
1998.
awesome film.
Wesley Snipes started the trilogy, directed by Stephen Norrington. Had pretty good box office back at the time. I actually saw us at theaters. I don't know if we ever we saw this together. If I saw it with Brad,
I think we did because I saw it at the theater also. I think I saw it twice at the theater.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. I mean,
Definitely saw it at the theaters.
Probably, I know we talked about Brandon Lee with comic book last week, but I'd say this is probably, in my opinion, one of the better, at least trilogy wise, one of the better comic book adaptations. What do you guys think?
Well,
For
I mean,
its day and time, it was absolutely at the top, because this would have been pre-Marvel Universe stuff, and so it's absolutely would have been top notch.
Yeah, I mean, these were definitely some of the best comic book movies before there were comic book movies. I mean, I think that Spider-Man and X-Men are the real reason that we like talking about X-Men 1 with Hugh Jackman and Spider-Man with Tobey Maguire, directed by Sam Raimi. I think those two movies are the real reason that we have comic book movies the way we know them now. You know what I'm saying? With the big budget, summer blockbusters, big effects, huge budgets, all that stuff. But before that, the good comic book movies was stuff like The Crow and Blade. I mean, the other comic book movies that you would have had would have been like Howard the Duck. You would have had TV shows like Incredible Hulk. And I mean, while those movies may or may not be entertaining, depending on how you want to look at it, they're definitely nothing along the lines of Blade or The Crow, talking about their quality, their story, the effects, all that kind of good stuff. Now, the effects, some of them don't really hold up, the computer effects. Now, the practical effects are really good. The computer effects are shockingly bad.
Yeah. And then, looking a little bit at the box office there. So $45 million.
Yeah, I would say that's one of my.
Yeah. Good. Sorry, $43 million budget, and it did make 70 in the U.S. and Canada and 131 overall. So I definitely say that was a hit at the time. And then it 4 years later made Blade 2, which we'll talk about, and then also Blade 3, the Trinity. I just want to talk about so Wesley Snipes. I thought the fight scenes were pretty good for the time. I know we all like the sweeping kicks and everything, so the fight scenes were good. Wesley Snipes being he's an action guy, but I thought he did they filmed it pretty well. Wide angles, a lot of kicking. It was kind of fast and sped up at times, and then his overall, he had a cool look with his outfit and the leather. Sunglasses are cool. Had some really good one-liners. Also wanted to know, I know Brad's a big car guy. What did you think about that 1968 Charger? Thought that was really cool.
That would have been one of my favorite parts of that movie. Being a car buff, I mean, it's a very iconic car for a lot of. It's been in other movies as well, like that model car has. But that definitely was one of the cool things about him. Like I said, his outfit and all was very cool. Talking about this being a comic book movie too, though, I think this one thing that helped it, however you want to say, is like I think most people probably went into this movie and watched it and had no idea it was a comic book movie. Blade wasn't necessarily a headliner comic either at that time. So, I mean, I think a lot of people just went into it thinking it was an action vampire type movie and not even realizing it was a comic book movie. But definitely, like you said, the practical effects, very good. Like I said, the costumes, amazing. The digital effects definitely did not look good. Even at the time, they have aged poorly, for sure.
Yes. So talking about,
I mean,
there we go.
This let me talk real quick. So like this is like talking about the special effects. This is actually a still of his hand, like Blade is cut off his arm and it's starting to like reform with the blood. This actually for a still doesn't look too bad, but when you watch it in motion, it looks pretty awful. But one thing that's really unique about this movie too, and abnormal, it is not common for your protagonist in a vampire movie to also be partial vampire himself. So Blade is actually what's called a dumpier. It's where you have a half human, half vampire, because what happened is his mother was bitten by a vampire as he was, before he was born. So he had vampire characteristics, but he was able to retain his human characteristics by the fact that he was not bitten. So, but that's another big thing. We've got another action movie more than a horror movie, and our protagonist actually has a lot of weaknesses that are not as forced as some of the vampires, meaning like he's a day walker. He can be in the sun that other vampires can't, but he still does have a lot of their same weaknesses, like thirst that he can't control quite like a human can control their hunger for food. You know, I mean, yeah, you're hungry, you need to eat, but you can kind of wait. Once they start to get hungry, they start to kind of lose control. So, but anyway, those were some really cool things.
Jumping off of that, I think that you're absolutely right. Just the fact of having a daywalker vampire makes this kind of again, a non-traditional vampire movie. But even beyond that, one of the things I love in just media in general or has, their own downside that they're trying to fight against. And the vampire movie, or vampire type genre gives you an excellent opportunity for that, because you do have occasionally where you'll see something like this, where the vampire is a reformed vampire, kind of like we saw in Sundown or in Blade here, where they hate what they are kind of thing. And therefore they're trying to do better, and that's kind of a neat story.
I want to add one thing real quick, and then Trey, I'm going to let you hop into 2 and 3. But what I wanted to say is kind of like what I was referring to in Underworld and in Sundown, where they had the synthetic blood. In Blade 1, they had this concept that you can see in the deleted scenes of having a blood bank where they had people that had IVs running out of them where they were not dead, but they were kind of in a comatose state. And they actually brought that back again in 3, where the vampires had a never-ending flow of blood, because they had these blood bags, these blood banks where these people were alive, but they were constantly making new blood for them that they could harvest. And they had these almost like ice boxes full of these people where they would have them in comas or whatever, but they would keep feeding them, which was also a pretty unique idea. I don't know of anything I'd seen that in before. So that's not quite the synthesized stuff like in Sundown, but it's a similar concept of how do we control our intake so that we can control our need, right?
Yeah, Zach, great information there, guys.
Real quick, that's neat.
Yeah, go ahead.
You do. Go ahead. I was going to say, so one thing that is neat about that is what you'll see in a lot of more modern vampire movies is that where they're trying to stay in the shadows. And so you do typically see some type of mechanism like the fake blood or the blood bank like Blade had, to be able to allow them to sustain without society realizing they're there, kind of thing. That's something that you typically see in a more modern vampire movie. A way to explain how they've lived for hundreds of years and we don't know they're here, kind of thing.
Yeah, also a couple of things I want to touch on. So techno music was great. I think the intro with the bloodbath, I mean, that was iconic.
That was also awesome.
Tracy Lord popping up in there. That was random.
I don't even know who she is. I mean, I know who Tracy Lords is, but I don't know who she is in the movie. I couldn't pick her out. I wouldn't be like, oop, there she is. I see her walk. I mean, I have no idea.
So she was the one that was kind of with the dude that brought the human in, was kind of flirting with him.
At the beginning?
Yeah.
That was when the movie opens,
she says, she said a curse word and, did that. And I think Blade, he did a spit kick on her or something, but she was in it.
For the longest time, I thought it was the blonde that was always with Stephen Dorff's character. But at some point in time, I was like, no, that's not her. But I never took the time to figure out who she actually was.
Yeah, she did. Yeah. Speaking of Stephen Dorff, want to get your thoughts on him as the villain. Then also, you might not know this. This is from IMDb. Guess who were two rumored cast members that pretty much were almost a given to play?
Which characters? Oh, Deacon Frost. Dude, I got to be honest. I'm not a huge Stephen Dorff fan. I mean, honestly, this is probably his best work. Either this or True Detective 3. I don't one or the other. But I don't know. Just about anybody would be better, I think. I mean, is it going to be like Christian Slater or something, kind of like The Crow last week, or River Phoenix or Joaquin Phoenix?
It's actually Jet Li and Mark Wahlberg. That would have been interesting. Jet Li turned down this for Lethal Weapon 4.
I would have liked to see
Jet Li would have been interesting. I think. Yeah. I don't think Mark Wahlberg would have been a great Deacon Frost. I don't see it. I see Mark Wahlberg's name thrown around with like every role ever that he didn't take, and almost like 90% of the time, I'm like, there's a reason he wasn't cast. I love Mark Wahlberg. I really do. He's a great action star and he's funny, but he doesn't need to be in everything.
Also, Chris Christopherson's Whistler, I thought was great too. He was really stood out. Great one-liners. The raspy kind of old veteran. He was a great.
And somehow, some way, he finds his way into every movie. Whistler's dead. No, he's not. Whistler's dead. No, he's not.
Also gave a shout out another personal favorite of mine, Guilty Pleasure, Nights. Chris Christopherson, that Albert Pune movie. I think we talked about that on the first. I remember that's probably my two favorite, The Blade and him in Nights. I don't even know what else Chris Christopherson was in. Or
he was in. Wait a minute. Wait for it. Wait. Fire Down Below with Steven Seagal.
Man. There's Steven Seagal. And real quick, what's that vampire movie, Chris? You need to watch it. Steven Seagal.
Okay, so all right, yeah, you said last week he's in like a vampire zombie movie or something, and I was like, he's in a what now? But it's called Against the Dark, and I think it's like at like a 2.7 on the IMDb. I watched it. I think there's a YouTuber. It's like Shadow Ice or Spider Ice or something is his name. He did a short like video that's just hilarious on like how awful the movie is, and it looks pretty bad.
Yeah, paycheck. Gotta get paid, man.
Paycheck.
Yeah, so that was all my thoughts on Blade 1998. Great in the vampire genre, non-traditional. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. I watched it several times. So
all right, fellas. Well, I think we're fixing to have another first. We've got a guest on the channel, and I think we're fixing to do something else. We had more content than I think we're going to be able to talk about right now. So I think we're going to have a part 2. How you feel about that, Brad? You going to hang around? Uh-oh, we might have lost Brad. All right, well, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We got to go to the video store. We got to hit that rewind button, and you'll see us again. We got 2 more movies we want to talk about.
Hey, make sure, Be Kind Rewind. We'll see you on the other side.
Thanks for having me. See y'all next time.
All right, see you.